Hey guys, Alex here. So this will be the third video in the series where we actually dive into the data. Um, Sorry about that. Every time I go to sit down to record this, there's somebody else calling. So hopefully we have some interrupted time right now. So sharing my screen, this was the last slide that we left off on video two, basically summing up the role of the microbiome, detoxification, potential for reabsorption, inflammation, bile, so on and so forth. So now we're going to talk about the test and the model, and I'll try to do this as cohesive as I can. Um, so, just to give some background, having done so many microbiome tests of different technologies over the years, it was the point where I realized, looking at the raw data on a 16S type test, that the issues with respect to my son's microbiome were being completely missed. What is the raw data? Well, the raw data is basically looking at the nucleotide sequence. When in this case, bacteria is being sequenced, there's a chain of nucleotides denoted by a character, CTAG, so on and so forth, that represents kind of like a barcode what that bacteria is. The way that we know that is because someone has basically caught this bacteria, grown it, and then sequenced it using the same technology. And that information makes up a database, kind of like a library or a dictionary, right? So if you want to know what the meaning of the word, anesthesiologist is, you look it up in a dictionary. It tells you that it's a physician that prescribes anesthesia for procedures. The dictionary gives us that information on the microbe. For that dictionary to exist, somebody has to catch the microbe. The word catch I'm using obviously, kind of in a kind of funny atmosphere there, and then grow it and then sequence it. And databases have changed over the time over time. There are databases that have come out, in the early 2000s. They've been updated by other groups. There's different databases, so you can basically check these dictionaries, if you will, for the sequence and see what the microbe is. Um, and not all stool tests are using the most updated databases. Not all stool tests are using the databases that are most complete. Turns out that the majority or most of microbiome literature actually resides with 16S type testing. Um, and if you're using a test that isn't looking at the entire fraction of the microbiome, then and there's a lot of them out there that do that, then you may be missing significant pieces of the puzzle that are basically implicating the dysbiosis. Well, what does that mean? Imagine, for instance, you were buying a house and I gave you a checklist. So the checklist is something to make sure that the house that you're buying is is going to basically determine if the house is reasonable. So checklist might say something like, okay, does it have bedrooms? Check. Does it have windows? Check. Does it have a roof that is operational? Check. Does it have a front door? Check, right? Is there power? Check. Or, is there a kitchen? So on and so forth. So you imagine these are the things that you would think of as um, being necessary boxes to check for a house that we want to buy. That type of stool test is basically looking at specific microbes that someone has determined that these are things that should be in an appropriate microbiome. The problem with that approach is that type of stool test or that kind of checklist will miss issues that aren't um, popular. So if you imagine visiting a house, and in this house, there's a toilet in the middle of the kitchen, it would be very, very, it's not really a common thing, right? No one would really think about something like that to make a checklist, right? To say that that's something that I want to check that doesn't happen. So, that's the problem with those types of tests where you're looking at specific sequences and you have specific set ranges on what those should be. If you don't have a test that's looking at the entirety of the house, okay, then you might miss these potential issues that are causing a problem. Let's say the house is full of pillows, right? Every room is full to the top full of pillows. But it's not something that you typically would imagine, right? Or for some reason, all of the windows are only in one room. These are very odd things. Now, with the 16S type test, it isn't looking at a checklist. Basically, what's happening is that the DNA is being amplified, and then those sequences that come out, they're being basically pinged to a database to see what that microbe is. That matching can happen at multiple levels. It could happen at the species level. Most of the information is at the genus level. It could happen at higher levels, like the phylum or the class or the order. So with that information, we get 100% view of what's going on in the microbiome, but at different levels. We may have the resolution down to the species level, but we might not. We might find out that there's a particular microbe that hasn't been found in our database, or it doesn't have the resolution to match at the species level, but I know it at the order, and it's taking up 32% of the microbiome. And that gives me enough information to go hunt it down and figure out what is going on over there. The database for 16S is very, very complete because the information has been around for so long. There's been so much work done on it. There's multiple databases. It gives you a resolution that's appropriate for solving dysbiosis if you know what you're doing, and it gives you a picture of the whole house. Now, you might say, so that's a reason why you would not want to do tests that only have like a checklist. If they're only giving you specific microbes on their checklist, and it's the same ones all the time with their ranges, that that's saying that they can't be helpful, but it's potential that you won't see the true picture. Whereas the true picture is sorting things from the most abundant microbes found to the least abundant microbes found. All of the data pieces are basically thrown out in between on a checklist type test. Culture-based tests are very inaccurate. This is something completely different because culture-based tests, basically where you take a sample, you send it to the lab, and they grow it on a medium. The time that it takes for that sample to get to the lab, the temperature that it lives in during that transit process all change the bacterial composition of what's in the stool because they're fundamentally growing it on a petri dish to see what grows. And then the medium that they're using, there's only certain you might find it's difficult to grow bacteria. Some bacteria grow everywhere. Other bacterias are much more challenging to grow. That's why making probiotics is actually so difficult in some situations. You have to find the food that it likes. So when you do these culture-based type tests where they're growing in a petri dish, more often than not, you get the same answer all the time. You're going to get the same things growing. Okay. And it's very susceptible to time and to transit. You can get proteobacteria to bloom like crazy. You can get Klebsiella to bloom like crazy in a sample if you leave it out. That's why, things like staph and strep are on all these surfaces because they just grow very well in those situations. It's been shown by, if you've ever looked at some of the lectures out there by Dr. Jason Harlech, that he's actually done experiments on that where they take the same sample and they send it to multiple labs and they find that the culture testing is like the least reliable because it's not reproducible at all. Um, in doing so many of the tests, I came up with reproducibility issues with a lot of the other tests out there. So one of the fundamental requirements is that your test has to be reproducible. What does that mean? If you send the same sample to to be tested multiple times, you should get the same answer within some confidence. Okay, what is that confidence? But I would say if it's not giving you this within 10% of the range for that particular microbe, then it's not a reproducible test. And this experiment has been done with some other companies out there, and you get vastly different results. There's some really popular ones out there that and people ask me about. And not only have I seen this, but I know other practitioners have seen this as well. So for instance, if you measure the bifidobacterium to be 3.2%, within 10% of that value, which would be, let's say, zero point 0.3, so 3.2 plus or minus zero point 0.3, that's a reasonable expectation of the variability there. You can actually get it to be tighter from that. But if you're not within that range, right, then there's something going on. And we're talking about for the same sample. You could see a little bit more variation if you're talking about sampling at different times during the day. In these situations, the experiment was done with the same exact sample. So it's the same stool, evenly dispersed amongst, 2 or 3 tests. Now, what about tests like shotgun metagenomics or metagenomic type sequencing? Well, there are some inevitable errors and uncertainties in that technology, although it is deemed as being more advanced, that make it less of a suitable tool for trying to help people out and to shift dysbiosis. Let me do my best to give you that example as quickly as I possibly can. So, the analogy that I like to use is there's 2 of them. One of them is kind of the borrowing on this idea of a cell phone. So you may imagine, when cell phones came out, we had a 3G type communication for the frequency, then we had 4G, then we have 5G, right? And as that technology advanced over the years, towards 5G, one of the limitations in 5G as it was starting to come out is that you had to have the cell towers that were able to support that technology so that the phone could be used. So for instance, if you bought a 5G only phone at a time when there wasn't a lot of 5G service and towers around, you may go to certain parts of your country and find out that it doesn't work at all because there's no 5G tower. However, since 3G came out significantly prior to that, if you had a 3G phone, much more likely that you're going to go to parts of the country or rural areas of the country and you're still going to have service. So the difference between a 16S test and a shotgun test with regard to the database, the completeness of the database is very similar to 3G and 5G. The completeness of the database for shotgun type testing is significantly less complete because there's more complexity involved. Like I said, you have to catch the microbe, you have to sequence it, you have to have done this first, right? And it was done initially with 16S. So the dictionary is much less complete. As a result, if something doesn't match in that dictionary, well, guess what happens on your test? That data gets thrown out and potentially missed as a result. Now, that's why having a 3G phone, although may not give you the resolution of the 5G, it's going to ensure that the phone works wherever you want it. That's kind of a broad example, kind of expanding on the differences there. Now, there's some other intricate differences in terms of the uncertainties involved. When you have shotgun type testing or this metagenomics type testing, or is more correct to talk about it from that perspective, you are not only sequencing the bacterial DNA, but you're sequencing everything. You get the bacteria, you get the fungi, you get the viruses, you get the protozoa. Regardless of whether or not you want to look only at the bacteria, it doesn't have a discrimination from one type to the other. So it's a much more complex problem. The problem is similar to this. With 16S tests, it would be like taking a single book that you know is in the library, a copy of it, ripping up all of the pages, or ripping out all of the pages and throwing them on the floor and say, okay, there's pages of this book on the floor. I don't know what the book is. I need to figure out what the book is. And to do that, I have to put the book back in the correct order so that I can match it against my library. So the challenge is putting these pages that are scattered on the floor in the correct order. You have to actually read the book, right? See if it makes sense. See if it makes cohesion. Because when you're doing sequencing, you are basically overlapping reads to make sure that you can reconstruct the full sequence. And for 16S test, it's one book. It's the same length of book. It's a much simpler problem to solve. With shotgun, it's like taking every book in the library because you're not only looking at bacteria, you're looking at fungi, you're looking at viruses, ripping up all of the pages, ripping out all of the pages, throwing them on the floor, and then scattering them around and say, okay, try to figure out what this one book is. So it's a much, much more complex problem. Because of that, some of that complexity ends up turning into errors and uncertainties. If there isn't a match found, or if it's too complex, it gets thrown out. What does that exactly mean? Well, in 16S testing, the length of the 16S gene is about 1,600 base pairs, somewhere in that range. So that's kind of like when you're sequencing it, you can think of it as like counting from 1 to 1,600 and not trying to mess up, right? If you've ever counted from 1 to 100, you might fumble along the way. It's actually smaller than that because we're looking at the V4 region, which is about 300, 250 base pairs, somewhere in that range. So it's a much simpler problem when you're looking at the 16S gene, which is only specific to the bacteria conserved in this way. Much, much shorter sequencing region that you're looking at. With metagenomic sequencing, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of base pairs, right? So it's trying to count to 100,000 and not mess up. There are these inevitable read errors that happen because of that. There's no way to kind of get rid of them. It's just a function of the technology. So when you get errors and when you have more complexity, naturally you're going to have more uncertainty. There's going to be more data thrown out. So you'd say, Alex, what's the benefit? Everyone says the metagenomic type sequencing is better. Better really depends on what your definition of what you're looking at. If I said what was better, an SUV versus a Corvette or a race car, they have different purposes. An SUV may allow you to traverse over different terrains. You can drive in the city. You can drive over a desert. You can drive through, the kind of three-dimensional jungle terrain. But a Corvette will serve you better on a flat, you know, open kind of terrain where you don't have these, huge variations in altitude and things like that. A metagenomics test is very powerful when you're trying to look at the potency of a probiotic, for instance. In that type of situation, what do you have? Well, I'm producing a probiotic. I know that maybe it's 95% pure. And there's an inevitable contamination that gets in there because you're growing something, right? It's like kind of like cooking something in the oven or there's things that get in there and that will grow and feed off of the prebiotic fuel that you have, and you're trying to limit them because you want to make this one strain. So in that type of experiment, if I have this powder that I produce that I think is this particular BB536, I want to measure that potency. Metagenomics will give you resolution down to the strain level. It's amazing for that. And in this situation, I know in the sample I probably have like two or three things in there, maybe 10 things at most, because I've created the experiment where I know it's this relatively pure substance. So it's very good at doing that. It's a much simpler problem, right? There's 10 books on the floor. And I'm looking for this, and I know one of them should be this one, right? With a microbiome, that's not the case. With a microbiome, it's not the case that you have one species in there. You have a whole conglomerate of everything, and everyone's microbiome is different. And that's why 16S test is better, is because the database is complete. You don't have this you're not necessarily looking for strain resolution. The argument is that if I even knew the strain level resolution in the microbiome, what does that do in terms of utility? I don't have therapeutics that work at the strain level. I don't have herbs that work at the strain level. I don't have prebiotics that work at the strain level. Our understanding of those things really exists at the genus level. So even if you told me strain level resolution without all of these errors that are included in there, it would be it from a clinical perspective of what to do with that, I wouldn't know what to do, right? It would take a really long time to figure out, okay, this particular herb is very, very helpful for this particular strain. So it's almost like too much information. It's almost like giving you a high resolution picture of a couple of rooms in the house at the expense of missing several rooms. Whereas 16S test is giving you a lower resolution picture, but it's giving you the whole house. This is besides the cost difference. This is besides the ranges that have been clinically developed for 16S tests that we're familiar with. So these are some of the reasons why I settled on 16S testing. Also looking at all of these other things. I'm going to pause here and then I'm going to start talking about the actual model that I developed as well. Okay, picking up where we left off. So we were about to jump into the model. Last piece I wanted to say on the types of stool testing is that I've had so many folks come to me doing some of these, quote unquote, more advanced tests, and you know, they 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 are not able to use them to help people in any way, and that's the problem, right? I think that so the if we were to summarize the basic, what's like kind of the axioms? Number one, the test has to be reproducible, right? If it's not, it's not a worthy test. Number two, it has to be representative in terms of being able to capture whatever is in the microbiome and not select things on a checklist that you have deemed to be appropriate. Number three would be, is it using the complete databases? One thing I didn't touch on is that actually bacterial naming has changed, and changes over time. There are Clostridium that are a part of certain genuses that are no longer considered Clostridium, and many tests out there are not even respecting the most updated databases. And the problem of just jumping to the most recent updated databases are that you are excluding clinical information that was based on literature historically. So really you need to kind of straddle from old to new to get a complete understanding. But if your test isn't respecting a database that's relatively complete, you're going to be missing a lot of data. And if your test is focusing on, I would say precision and level resolution at the expense of throwing a lot of data out because of the complexities and the uncertainties involved in it, that makes it non-ideal. Finally, if you can't actually use the test to clinically help anybody, if it's just this fancy report, the fanciest tool is meaningless unless you know how to use it. So I think the final point there is that do you actually have clinical improvement using the test, right? Can you show that? Um, so those are kind of the axioms that I think are required for having a test. Um, the model that I built is based on multiple pipelines in the 16S environment. So, because bacterial naming has changed significantly over time, and trying to combine that information so that you could respect literature and information based historically, and whatever therapeutics might be indicated in those situations, and also with the newest information we know about these particular microbes and how they behave and what classes and genuses that they belong to. So, in looking at so many tests over the years, thousands of tests, some of the pushback from microbiome researchers is that it's just too complex. There's too many species. We don't know what the good microbiome is. It's everyone's microbiome is different. Oh, it depends on where you live. It depends on what you eat. Um, if you actually want to help somebody out, don't listen to any of these people. You can find the fanciest PhDs with these microbiome engines and things like that, and they've actually helped no one. And all they do is they come back and they say what you can't do. I'd say spend a day in a clinic and somebody that actually is helping people, and you can see what the differences are. If you make the problem infinitely complex, you're not going to be able to help anybody. But if you simplify it, right? And that's what clinicians do at different levels. If you simplify it, that's where you can hone in on what's going to help them out. So, in looking at so many different samples over the years, the obviously the problem is extremely complex, but if you're just focused on getting healing or getting things to be closer to people in the middle, you can harness that simplicity and come up with suggestions to take a dysbiotic microbiome and make it more favorable. Will it be the perfect microbiome? No, not necessarily. But the argument is that you know do we need the perfect car, or do we just need a car that's going to drive us to work and get us across town, right? Do we need to, live and take a hotel room in the Ritz-Carlton, some fancy hotel, or can we just get by in a simple Best Western, right, for the purpose that we need? And my argument is that these folks with extreme dysbiosis that have all of these metabolic dysfunctions, we can get you to that Best Western. And in doing so, there's translates to a lot of clinical upside. And let's focus in on that. So, in trying to make the problem more simple, I found that there were 26 modes of imbalances that were continuously coming up. And I'm focusing on those. And this is after looking at, thousands of stool samples over time. This is a painting of that over here. Obviously, there's other things that I look at, but making the analytic model that is somewhat automated, beyond what I do in a manual point so that other practitioners can use it is based off of these 26, different levels. And they could be at the phylum, they could be at the genus, some of them are at the species. Things that are in red on this slide here are, overgrown, if you will. More commonly, things that are in blue are things that can be potentially, you know, underemphasized. This is just a blur. I already talked about this, talking about different types of tests and the expense, and then what they're actually looking for and the precision. And like I said, those five axioms, ending with the last one, if you can't actually use your test to help somebody out, in my book, it has no meaning, right? So here's an example of different interventional situations based on overgrowth or deficits that commonly come up. If an individual presents with very low levels of Faecalibacterium, Bacillus coagulans with the particular strain, MTCC 5856, is very helpful at helping to increase that genus. It produces metabolites to help encourage Faecalibacterium to grow. There are other ways to increase Faecalibacterium, but I have found that this is kind of tried and true, and it's very simple. Um, Certain situations, probiotics will help emphasize things, not necessarily the species or the strain that you're looking for. In this case, it's Bacillus coagulans. Has nothing to do with Faecalibacterium. It's just emphasizing Faecalibacterium. Certain situations, probiotics can help dampen down overgrowths. So probiotics can be thought of as these kind of policing agents. They help bring things down, they help bring things up. They very rarely will colonize. There are some strains that will colonize and actually join the ecosystem because they do it better than other ones. But I'd say more often than not, they kind of have this policing function, and you knowing how to use them is another tool in the toolbox. Deficits of bifidobacterium, the most effective and safest prebiotic, is going to be Biomedical, particularly because it doesn't encourage Bacteroides to grow. There are other things like HMO, human milk oligosaccharide that also increase bifidobacterium. However, they tend to emphasize other things. Even some, I think there's some other people have posted about them emphasizing different types of Ruminococcus, navis, and stuff like that. Um, so I find it to be less helpful, whereas Biomedical has a lot of clinical backing, a lot of studies. It's super safe. It can be used almost in any situation. Um, even for desulfibrio, hydrogen sulfide, SIBO, it helps to bring that down. Really safe. Prebiotic won't increase your Bacteroidia, which is gram-negative, where HMO will. There are other things like acacia that can also help as well, but acacia tends to be a little bit more broad, and some people can't take it for different reasons. The way that you can encourage microbes is through the prebiotic that feeds them. That's a dominant way. Um, Commensals. So these are kind of the groupies in the middle, right? Partially hydrolyzed guar gum, PHEG, is a super, super, super safe prebiotic. Helps bring water into the colon, very appropriate for all types of SIBO. Tasteless white powder, super broad, very low, very slow acting, and it helps to bring up some of these butyrate producing commensals. Psyllium husk can help in some other ways. It's not something that I start out with, but it can be warranted over time to help boost some other genus in there that are butyrate producers. So this is just kind of a list going down, right? We have deficits, we have overgrowths, and in trying to make this model, the idea that I had was, okay, well, we know some of these expert relationships already because there's clinicians using this in the field or there's some published literature on them. We know that this does that. This increases this, this reduces this. So I was kind of taking that starting point, combining it with scouring all of the literature based on how the microbiome changes with prebiotics, probiotics, herbs, trying to find some of the most exotic things, but that are also positive. Put them into a matrix and then narrow it down and say, okay, these are my 26 different situations. What are the tools that I could use in those situations? And then honing it down and scrubbing it, that list for feasibility, right? Does this thing taste bad? Is it actually feasible for somebody to take? How can they get access to it? Is it readily available? Can you buy it over the counter? Is it a non-prescription? We work only in non-prescriptions here. But is it available in this country? So further refining the list. Then also trying to emphasize or I guess navigate towards things on the list that have a very long history of positive use in different cultures. Chamomile tea is very positive in the Mediterranean world, right? Does a lot of positive things. Triphala, very positive in the Indian descent, right? Or that region of the world. So there are these things that kind of have a historical backing. Codonopsis has more of a, I think, Chinese Asian descent there, where you get a lot of there's benefits into to the microbiome. We use it for desulfibrio, hydrogen sulfide desulfibrio, very helpful there. So trying to refine and scrub the list further. Finally, in implementing this over the years with so many people, the list has been further scrubbed. So we have this kind of expert toolbox of situational, components that can help to move dysbiosis in a certain direction. There's always going to be feasibility. There's always going to be practicality, and some things being easier to take than others, right? But to give you an example, something like oregano oil has an awful taste to it, very impractical to use, but it's also nukes the biome. Although it may be very helpful in eradicating some fungal things, you're probably going to take out a lot of things with it. So this is what is mean by kind of gut balancing, and we're respecting all of these things that actually matter. I touched on this a little bit earlier, the bacterial naming. So this is the thing that I think that is least understood. People think that like you do the test and there's some magical computer that says, "Hey, you got Clostridium." It doesn't work like that. So it gives you a string of nucleotides. Then you have to match that. You have to put the string back together because it's usually chopped up into pieces. Um, that denoising process takes some math involved. And then you match it against what's in the database. And it could potentially match to different things because there's similarities between the sequences. But eventually you hit on a match. That database might be telling you that you have, okay, Clostridium cochleatum, right? But that database was compiled, let's say in 2005, when this microbe was known or agreed upon to be called Clostridium cochleatum in the Clostridium genus. That information is dynamic. With the way that a microbe is discovered is that a name is kind of assigned to it based on what the grouping and what the understanding is, but it changes over time. This is an example of microbes on this page that were formerly considered Clostridium genus and have moved to other genuses based on new information. So if your test is not respecting the newest information out there, largely governed by entities like NCBI, you could be talking about one thing, but it's really called something else, depending on what literature you're looking at. And so this happens a lot. It happens in the Bacteroides genus. There's a lot of Bacteroides that are no longer Bacteroides. So you might even have to look at things at multiple levels to really get an understanding of what's going on. Is your test doing that? Is it really using the correct terminology? This is an example showing you that NCBI hierarchy here for C. diff. Interestingly enough, right, it was called Clostridium difficile, but this was actually regrouped in 2016. It's no longer part of the Clostridium genus. It's now part of the Clostridoides genus, which is a new genus different from Clostridium. What does that mean? Does that mean it's any less caustic? No, but there 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 are consequences of not being able to talk about the same microbe, and this is part of the reason why you can't look at two different tests. You have to look at one test that's inclusive and good and respectful of all of this information, but also respectful of the history. Here's another thing that's commonly misunderstood. I am always hearing this thing, Clostridia, from so many clinicians out there, and it makes my mind kind of go numb sometimes. I know what they're talking about, right? They're probably using Clostridia to mean like the plural for Clostridium. But Clostridia is actually referring to a class of bacteria. You can think of it this hierarchy, this phylogenetic tree is imagine if we were talking about where you live. So you have an address, you live on a street, that street is in a town, the town is in a city, the city's in a state, the state is in a country. This kind of tree, this phylogenetic tree, this hierarchy can specify the microbe at different levels. And sometimes you can only figure out resolution down to the town. Sometimes you can figure it down to the exact address, depending on the similarities or the uniqueness in the database or the uniqueness in the technology. Clostridia is kind of like the state, if you will, right? It's not meant as the plural of Clostridium, which is the genus, which is further down. It's more like the block that you live on, but it's being used in that sense. The reason why that this matters, you'll see this on the O test. First of all, some of these microbes that they're listing over here, it's a little bit misleading because, and you can actually ask the author that kind of, pioneered this technology. This doesn't mean that these caustic metabolites are produced by solely these microbes. And I think it correctly says on others, there are many other bacteria that will produce HPHPA. These are some of them. So it doesn't definitively say that you have that, right? And how could you expect that measuring a metabolite in a urine is going to compete with actually doing sequencing actually in the microbiome? But the reason why I'm harping on this Clostridia so much is because if you actually were talking about healthy levels of Clostridia, which is not the plural of Clostridium, but is a class of microbe, people have people that are healthy have 50% of their microbiome taken up by Clostridia because it's a much higher level. It's like saying how many people live in my state, right? Versus how many people live on a really, really, really bad block in my state. So the range for Clostridia in the gut, even between bad and good, is like 20 to 70%. Um, Clostridium, the genus itself should be a much kind of finer level. There should be closer to probably well under 1% as a genus, but there are other pseudoclostridium that are outside of that particular genus that are also non-ideal. So it doesn't take away from the pathogenicity of the test. It just adds confusion in terms of what we're talking about when we're comparing things. I'm going to take a little pause here. Hey, thank you. So yeah, we just kind of summed up the whole Clostridium naming component there, really kind of emphasizing how, you know, correctly calling bacteria at their level or looking at the changes in the naming can be really instrumental in either missing an issue or correctly categorizing an issue. So jumping to kind of this is kind of a picture of the test that I've designed and the metrics. This is a situation as an example where an individual has almost 80% of their microbiome being taken up by gram-negative Bacteroideia. So Bacteroideia is a higher level. Historically, I think people were looking at things like Bacteroides, which is a genus. But however, since there's been so many renamings out of that genus, if you're looking at newer databases, you may not get the same measurement of the dysbiosis or the imbalance that you may have looking at an older database. Looking at a newer database has that advantage, right? But but if your clinical understanding is based on an older database, then you kind of have to bridge that gap. So in this sample here, the person has nearly no Faecalibacterium, nearly no Akkermansia, nearly no Bifidobacterium. Lactobacillus is less than ideal, although typically, it doesn't take up a big part of the microbiome in general. And then we have these huge levels of Bacteroideia, right? If we were to look at something like the Clostridium or pseudo-Clostridium section here, you'll find out we have like enteroclasters taking out a percent. This is not ideal. The relative issue, right, in terms of abundance, this is abundance of the entire sample. Like one's like 80 versus one is, a percent here. One is actually a different, we're looking at Bacteroideia versus a genus, but if we looked at Bacteroideas, it was taking up 50% there too as well. That's not to say that the enteroclaster is less of an issue, but when you're looking at trying to balance the biome, many of these tests are only focusing on, hey, there's something bad, kill it. Something bad, kill it. Yeah, Bacteroides are really not thought of as bad, but when they're too elevated, they're bad. So you have to kind of have an appreciation of the entirety of the pie in order to get balance. The difference with this type of test here in the pipeline that I have created is that I'm straddling multiple databases over time. So this is this exact sample, and this is the full, result of pinging these databases after reconstructing the sequence and denoising it. And you can see here we have the percentage that it's taking up, 55 roughly percent, and it's being found on this database as a Bacteroides species. In a newer database, it's being found as a Phocaecola. In two other databases, which are a little bit older, it's also registering as a Bacteroides. And then finally, looking at NCBI BLAST, we're resolving it to Phocaecola vulgaris. Now, anybody who understands the microbiome and works in this world knows that Bacteroides vulgaris has been renamed to Phocaecola vulgaris. And if you're only looking at Bacteroides, you'd miss this, right? This kind of multiple database view allows you to take appreciation for historical clinical tools and understanding to kind of more modern, correct naming. And regardless of whether you're using the old or the new one, there's 50 some odd percent taken up here by a single species. This is not ideal. This is dysbiotic. So that's kind of the foundation that this gut balancing is built upon. That's different from some of the other tests out there. Only really helpful for the person that understands it and can use it, but the model itself is meant to kind of stratify those suggestions to make it more feasible so that people can participate and clinicians can see. So here is kind of the part of our website, autismisbiomedical.com, where you can see there's just have all of these whatever testimonials and links there. One of them is a link to the data for this paper, which I'm going to review now. Now that I've had this really, really long kind of prelude about all of this stuff, and then talk about the results of the participants. Excuse me. So there was originally 72 participants from the year end between July 2025 and the end of 2025. 5 of those were had indicated that they had PANS or PANDAS specifically, because we work with all type of special needs situations, and we basically separated that from the data that we wanted to present here, which is specifically ASD diagnosis only, as reported by a parent or a caregiver or caretaker. This is the distribution of the participants by age. You'll see as I'm presenting this that I'm going to have different slides sometimes for the same information. It's because the data that was captured, and analyzed by me was then also vetted by a statistician and presented it sometimes in a slightly different way. So that's exactly what I'm showing here. So this is kind of another view of this data, where we're looking at the age range, the percentage of the 67 participants here. So mean age for the participation in this gut balancing program for this period was about 10.1 years old, standard deviation about 7. The range was about 1 to 30 years old. And most of the individuals were male, about 90% of them. Most of the responses were given by mom, about 82% of them, followed by fathers, and then teacher or some other classification there. The survey data was based on a 200 question questionnaire that we developed based off of other metrics that exist out there, like the ATEC and the SRS2. And that was taken at the end of the intervention period or the participation period, which was at 6 weeks. Get to that specifically as we go through the slides here. So one of the questions that we asked was the severity of the incoming individual, because we think that that makes a difference in kind of ruling out, because autism is this broad word, right, that means so many different things these days, that it's very hard to get an understanding of what specifically we're talking about. So we asked mild, moderate, mild to moderate, moderate to severe, severe, and unsure. The most dominant category here was moderate to severe for the participants, as you can see. Obviously, this is going to be a subjective opinion of the assessor, but everything is always going to be subjective, at least at this stage. We also asked the question from a different perspective, what was the functioning level? Because we understand that you can have severe afflictions in autism, but there may be a higher functioning that exists. So the most dominant response is that these are not high functioning individuals, at least subjectively observed by the caretaker or parent. So how did we formulate the assessment? So, I think that there's strengths to some of the assessors out there. We decided to go with modified metrics for the ATEC and the SRS2. These are already assessors that are out there and exist, and they've been used clinically. And we added several symptoms, behaviors, question traits based on the 300 plus participants that we had previously with a much simpler survey. Total of about 200 questions. And the modifications to the SRS2 and the ATEC were basically made to capture the change in the individual. We think that some of the limitations of those tests are they bucket the answer into not true, sometimes true, often true, so on and so forth, where the parent is interested in things like the improvement or the worsening. So, for instance, if one of the questions is that stimming, well, you can have an individual that sometimes stims, right? Maybe they stim every hour of every day. Maybe they took a therapeutic that produced that stimming by 75%, but they're still stimming sometimes. So they would still fall into that category. And then assessment would not correctly measure the change because of these very kind of, broad, categories there. Whereas if we change the question to slightly improved, moderately improved, significantly improved, slightly worsened, moderately worsened, significantly worsened, or not applicable or unsure, which is what we did in the case of our SRS2 and custom questionnaire, kind of did so in the same regard with the ATEC, you'd get a much better representation of the changes. And ultimately, that's the thing that we're looking for, right? People want to assess change and benefits or worsening. So here's the results of the first section, and we're going to present these results in different ways, right? Hopefully we don't get lost in the analytical assessment of what's going on. This is the first section, so this is the SRS2, Social Responsive Scale version 2, and in this category, there's about 65 questions, and these questions obviously asked to all of the participants, 67 here are the responders completing them. So now we're tallying the responses, the number of responses across all of the people kind of thrown into one bucket. What fraction of them indicated that they improved slightly? on these questions. What fraction of them improved moderately? What fraction improved significantly? So if we want the answers to those questions, 23% of all the responses, which is about 1,000 responses, were checking the box for improved slightly, about 14% for moderately improvement, about 7.8% for significant improvement. And if we add up the totality of the improvement here, there's about 45% representation of improved responses. If we get rid of the NAs, because some of these questions won't be applicable, like for instance, I don't know, we could pick something out like seizures, right? If your child doesn't have seizures, then it's not something that they can improve upon. So if we take out the NAs, the value of improvement actually jumps up to be about 59% of the responses are indicating some level of improvement. Now, these are all different questions molded, through some of them may be on representations of expression and communication. Some of them may be on behavior, but this is one way of looking at it. Asking the same type of question, only about 1 to 2% of all the responses ever reflected any type of worsening. About 26% of the responses were reflecting that those particular items didn't change at all. And if we look at something like the improvement to worsening ratio, there's about a factor of 31. So 3,100% increase or, relative to more improvement than worsening. This is just for the SRS-2 section 1, only these 65 questions. These are some of the highest weighted improvement questions. So if you imagine that we kind of came up with a metric where significant improvement had a factor of 3, moderate improvement had a value of 2, slight improvement had a value of 1, and we kind of did a weighted average of all of those. These would be the questions that scored the highest weighted improvement. So the number one in this section is able to imitate others' actions, right? The second one is would rather be alone than with others. Don't take that to mean that the child would rather be alone. It just means that there's improvement in this area, right? Seems self-confident when interacting with others. Parent or the assessor is saying that they are seeing improvement in this area. So you can go down the list over here, you can see, which of the things that appear to have benefited. The 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one down is able to communicate his or her feelings to others. Expressions on his or her face don't match what he or she is saying. We're seeing improvement in that. Is not well coordinated. We're seeing improvement in that. And then the least improved item is something like gets teased a lot, which, think about it, you could conceivably see, right? That's probably going to be something that's going to be very difficult to change, regardless of the individual seeing improvement. So this information, I'll just kind of poke back at the 2 slides and people can kind of see, when they're rewatching the video, what the questions are. First page, second page, I'll sit here for a little bit in case people want to take a look at these questions, and then third page here. Second section of this 200 question questionnaire is the custom symptom behavior trait section. So these are the questions that we design based on years of experience and also the prevalence of these issues on intake questionnaires. So these would be things like, teeth grinding and stimming and giddy laughter and waking in the night. And, we'll show the full list later on. In this section, same idea, looking at the number of responses, putting everyone's responses together. About 75% of the responses, when we remove the NAs in this section, are some level of improvement. If you leave the NAs in there, it's about 57%. Remember, the NAs are the things that are not applicable for that individual person. If we look at the worsening category here, only about 2 to 3% show any worsening for any of these. They'll pull all the questions together. Only about 3% of the questions responses ever indicated there was any worsening. about 16% indicating that there's no change at all. Improvement to worsening ratio factor of 21. We're going to dig a little deeper. This is a 35 question section. So this is same kind of idea. We have weighted this based on the improvement to the worsening. We set up a scale, 3, 2, 1, 3 for significant improvement, 2 for moderate improvement, 1 for slight improvement, and then weighted the responses. So this is sorted from the top down, from the most significant improvement to the least significant improvement. And then we have some other metrics here as well. Teeth grinding had come up as the most weighted improvement, with 90% of the people who were responding indicating there was an improvement in this metric or this particular trait or behavior. Receptive communication. So did you see an improvement in receptive communication? Yes. 88% of the individuals responding said that they did. It's representing 65 responses. Whereas in the teeth grinding category, although it was 90%, there was a lot of people that didn't have that as a symptom. So we're taking the NA out of it, right? In the case of receptive communication, you can assume that there's going to be a larger fraction of people that are going to have that issue. 88% of them indicated reporting, representing 65 people. Okay. No worsening at all. And then next to this, we're showing the improvement to worsening ratio. When it's infinity, it means that there was nobody that worsened in that category. So going down the list, teeth grinding, receptive communication, interaction, toe walking, inability to understand, aggressive behavior, awareness and focus, playfulness and happiness. With the least improved weighted metric being suspected seizures, but noting that there was not very many people out of the 67 that actually indicated that seizures would be an issue at all. So there's a lot of NAs there. Regardless, that's what the numbers dictate. So this is giving you a perspective of what gut balancing has the potential to impact with the fraction of the people that have participated and the percentages that we're seeing here. Same exact data, just in a graphical form. The green component is the fraction that have improved. Gray would be that it would be an NA, or it does not apply. And anything red or kind of pale yellow is going to be some worsening here. This is questions 1 through 6. This is questions 7 through 12. I'm going to pause a little bit on this. Sensitivity to loud noises, bright lights, craving for carbs and sweets. Questions 13 to 17. Unusual fear or anxiety in certain situations. Side glancing of eyes. Look at the suspected or known seizures. You can see here's the improvement bucket, but then this is a huge NA. At least that's what the caretaker is reporting. Right? Questions 18 to 23. Toe walking being also another huge NA. We're leveraging stomach over objects, pushing against them. You know, it's something that we've experienced in people that have some GI issues. They'll push over a chair or something like that. Questions 24 to 29. We're going to hone in on these couple of questions here. Ability to communicate in general, ability for expressive communication, ability for receptive communication, ability to comply with daily tasks and routines. And if we look at the improvement, it's almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the representation of all the participants are showing some level of improvement in this area. Ability to interact with family, friends, or instructors, also very high. Ability to sit or attend tasks for very long periods of time. Awareness and focus. Apparent playfulness and happiness over the day. One of the questions was just a subjective overall improvement. Slight, moderate, or significant. Section 3, the A text section. Now, keep in mind the ATEC is really designed for being having utility at a much younger age. Some of those questions become a little bit obsolete as the individual gets older. We kind of knew this going into this, right? Um, but meaning that there's some functionality that they surpass on the assessors of this test as they get older. But it's nice because it's a metric that's been used for so long and it has different sections that we can scrutinize a little bit deeper. So section 1, speech and language communication, 2 is sociability, 3 is the sensory cognitive awareness, 4 is health and physical behavior. So in this ATEC modified setting, we did not segment the responses into slight, moderate, and significant. It was just improved, stayed the same, or worsen. Um, and the reason, along with the scoring, and the reasoning is because it was just way too many responses then. We wanted to keep the original scoring present as well. Um, so there isn't that granularity that we have with the other two sections. But that being said, we still see similar type of behaviors. So in the speech section, if we pooled all of the responses together, 41% of the responses are indicating 42 nearly some level of improvement in the speech domain. 58 stayed the same, none have worsened. 52% improvement in the sensory and cognitive awareness, right? So the worsened is always very small, and the improved is we believe is quite large, and the only next category that comes close to it in representing size is either staying the same. Keep in mind, some people might improve for some things, but stay the same in others, and vice versa. These are the questions sorted by their reported improvement in terms of the reporting or the percentages for this ATEC. So it kind of goes down here and it kind of comes up here. Can follow some commands was one of the most significant improved. Constipation, no eye contact, tuned in, not spacey, curious, not interested. Then there's some custom question sections. So we ask some specific subjective but qualitative questions, right? What percentage of improvement overall would you estimate that you saw after this round of gut balancing? This is taken at the 6th week. And here are the responses. And the x-axis here is the reported percentage improvement. Obviously, it's very subjective. So it says my child improved 10%, right? But at the same level, this is the assessment that we're left with, right? Parents are assessing this. So you can see kind of a spread. Some individuals reported some significant improvements, over 65%, some at 50%, and then kind of like a blurring in between with a lot reporting in the 10% category. In terms of cost effectiveness, excuse me, compared to other therapies, for example, FMT, SCT, neurofeedback, MERT, with 1 being very cost effective and 5 being the least cost effective, how would you rate this? So we had the most significant response in the very cost effective category. And you can see it's biased towards that end. Have other family, friends, or individuals that participate in your child's life noticed clinical improvement from participating in gut balancing? So 60, I think it's 61 or 62 of the 67 responded yes. It's a very high fraction. This isn't 60%, it's the number of responses here. Remembering that we only had 67 responses in total. Approximately at what point did you start to first notice improvements? The most dominant category is the 3rd week. That typically has been my experience in doing this all these years. Regarding any bloating or gas from your perspective, has there been any worsening or improvement? So the most dominant category has improved moderately, followed by then improved significantly, or not present does not apply. Regarding any constipation from your perspective, obviously this won't be appropriate for everybody. Has there been improvement? The most dominant category has been improved significantly, followed by not present or does not imply. Are there any noticeable GI issues? Were there any improvements or worsening in this area? The two most dominant categories were improved moderately and significantly. So this would be like mechanical GI issues, leveraging, complaining of a tummy ache, maybe, um, you know, self-injury or something like that. So now here's kind of the more statistical analysis, and going back to the same kind of components, but looking at it from a different lens. So if we were to look at the severity simply from the ATEC metrics, right, because we're able to reconstruct those scores because we kept that scoring the way that it was, but just added additional questions. This is how the scoring would basically align, assuming that you had a score of 210, 2 for being kind of the the questions on there are always, sometimes, and never. I believe that's the phrasing there. So these are kind of the incoming scores for each section based on the ATEC. The mean ATEC is somewhere translating to roughly about 70, but you have to take that with a grain of salt because there are different versions of the ATEC out there. We're using this 210 scoring, where some of the older scorings or some of the different scorings actually use a 3210. They actually allow for a fourth choice on that last section of the ATEC, which would inflate the ATEC actually higher than what you see here. We've only kept it to 3 because we wanted to have consistency, but also reduce complexity for the participant and not have confusion, and which would represent the survey being incorrect. So one of the questions that we asked, looking at a statistical kind of analysis of this, were caregiver reported outcomes indicative of overall improvement following the intervention? So we are looking at specifically just the ATEC and the custom symptom behavior trait section of the survey. And with the data, we've calculated this mean change and a confidence interval for that particular section. So what does that mean, a mean change? Well, if you put a numbering on the response of 0, 1, 2 for the possible answers, meaning no change or improvement or worsening, you can then basically reconstruct what the net improvement would be. In this case, there was overall improvement across all of the categories with a confidence interval that it was also positive. Just going to pause it here for 1 second. Hey there. For all those people that are wondering why I keep on pausing the video, is just because I keep on getting interrupted with calls on the side. So um, basically going back over this slide. So now we've moved away from the severity, and now we're looking to see what the mean improvement or worsening would be for this section over here. Just so to explain this again, this is actually looking at the response part of the question that says, is there a improvement, worsening, or no change, which would be the responses with regard to the ATEC, and with regard to the CSBT, which is the custom symptom behavior trait questionnaire. They had a little bit more granular response of slight, moderate, or significant improvement, or slight, moderate, or significant worsening, or NA. And keep in mind, the reason why we made it less granular for the ATEC is because ATEC also has to answer the sometimes the not true and the always true questions, so it would be way too many and confusing. So we just left it as improved, worsened, or stayed the same. And if you ascribe now a number to these situations, -1 being worsening, +1 being improvement, or 0 being stayed the same, The point 4 is a representation of the mean of all of those values added up together. So the fact that it's positive, meaning that it's biased, one would be improvement in everyone in every different condition. Negative one would be worsening in everyone in every different condition. So we landed at point 4 on the positive side of the spectrum here with a statistical confidence of 0.32 to 0.48, meaning that, outside that 5%, bucket of chance, um, there's a very high confidence since it's on the positive side that we're overall seeing improvement. Um, so this is great because we did this across all of the sections here. We also report the median value, the number that have improved, the percentage reporting in those specific categories. We did the same thing for the CSBT, which has a slightly different scale. So that could go from -3 to +3 because you have slight, moderate, and significant, and positive to negative improvement to worsening. So both analyses of these questionnaires statistically show a mean improvement that's positive and a confidence interval that's positive as well. This is basically reiterating exactly what I said over here. The fact that we've seen this in two different questionnaires, one of them that the ATEC is, obviously clinically validated, and then our custom symptom behavior questionnaire. We're encouraged by that, and we're also encouraged by the results. Second question, were improvements widespread or driven by a few outliers? So, if you had, for instance, if you wanted to assess, scores on a test, right? You could have, you know, half of the class fail the exam, and maybe a quarter of the class does passes, and then the rest of them get all hundreds, and a few amount of very high scores could impact the rest of the sample. So that's why you have to look at a kind of a deeper statistical analysis and the spread of the data. So by the fact of showing the proportion of the participants and that number also being high as a representative fraction, we are showing that the improvement is broad, is across the participants rather than a few people that just improve significantly. You can see this percentage is very high for all of the sections of the questionnaire. What do the confidence intervals mean in this table here? So as I was alluding to before, the mean improvement is positive for one of these categories. But if we wanted to look at it, statistically, because the problem is that you're always sampling a population, right? And the sample that you are taking may not be reflective of the true population. If you were to test everybody that had autism, you'd never have to look at something like confidence. But it's possible that in your sampling, because of the size of the number of participants, that it might not completely reflect the entirety of everyone out there that has autism. I think that question in itself is just extremely broad in general. But the confidence interval here, which is this range, in the case of speech language communication, of 0.32 to 0.48, what that means is that based on the data, there's a 95% chance that the true mean, the actual mean for everybody that would ever participate in this, or everyone, is within this range, 0.32 to 0.48. There's a 95% chance. And the fact that that confidence interval is positive, meaning that it doesn't float below the zero and have some negativity, meaning that we're seeing improvement for, even with this statistical analysis. And so it puts a lot of confidence in the results or the correlation that we're trying to draw from it. How big and how prevalent were the changes? So to analyze this, we looked at the magnitude of the change, but we also looked at the prevalence of the change. I really like this next graphic here. The only problem with it is it's very busy. There's a lot of things on one page, so it takes some time getting used to looking at it. So on this graphic here, along the x-axis, we have the prevalence of the specific behavior trait or symptom for this section, the CSBT. Things like sound sensitivity or ability of potty training, teeth grinding, blank staring, night waking, inability to understand, urine accidents, complies with daily tasks. Along the x-axis from left to right, meaning the prevalence. So if it's towards the left, it's not as common of a behavior, symptom, or trait. If it's towards the right, it was answered as a commonality in virtually everyone. And along the y-axis is the magnitude of improvement or worsening. So remember, in this section, we had scoring of -3 to +3. +3 meaning significant, +2 meaning moderate, +1 meaning slight improvement. So on this graphic, looking at the y-axis, you can see as I get towards the top and towards the right, I have both a high level of improvement and also a high level of prevalence. And as I get towards the bottom left, I would have less prevalence and also potentially worsening. So we basically see that the mean values for these things, they're all positive. And we can assess the prevalence. Suspected or known seizure, as you would imagine, not everyone's going to be having that issue. I think that this is a really interesting graph. So the same, type of data, but basically looking at it from the ATEC perspective now. So here we're looking at which specific symptoms and functional abilities demonstrated the greatest and least change, not necessarily the prevalence like we were doing on the last graphic there. So we have the different sections of the ATEC separated out here. We have the metric sorted by its improvement. The fact that it's to the right side of this horizontal is meaning that they're all having some level of improvement. And then the bar here is representing the 95% confidence for each one of these metrics. So interesting to see, right? We have improvement basically in everything, and you can kind of see the statistical significance of the responses recorded. Things like no eye contact, constipation, curious and interested, can follow some commands are at the top. Speech tends to be meaningful and relevant, understands explanations, anxious and fearful, we have an improvement. Does not imitate, we have an improvement. So here's just some verbiage talking about some of those, most meaningful things, right? Most pronounced improvement was observed for can follow some commands. Basically, with that mean improvement score of 0.67, where 1 would be the maximum. Confidence interval 0.55 to 0.79. Constipation was another one that was quite significant. Mean score 0.61, where 1 is the maximum. Confidence interval of 0.48 to 0.74. And then no eye contact. Confidence interval 0.44 to 0.69 with the mean at 0.57. Which specific symptoms and functional abilities demonstrated the greatest and least change? So here we're looking at basically this kind of dichotomy on the SRS2 section, and no longer looking at ATEC, between the worst improved metric, the metrics that improve the least and the metrics that improve the most. So things like this on the right is able to imitate others. Things like this on the left, does it recognize when others are trying to, I think it says take a turn is the rest of the question, and we have the full question there. And then the error bars representing that 95% confidence. Would rather be alone with others, improvement. Seems confident when interacting with others, improvement. Is able to understand meaning of other people's, I think it says description or asks or wants, improvement. Largest gains on the SRS2, were found in reflecting foundational social, cognitive, and interactive skills. So for instance, is able to imitate, right? One of the largest improvements, mean value 1.58, where we said the maximum would be 3 in this case. The ATEC, the maximum would be 1. CSBT maximum would also be 3. So doing that same kind of analysis, we've kind of already looked at this in one way or another for the CSBT. Teeth grinding was one of the top ones, 1.98, confidence interval 1.49 to 2.31. Some other ones, inability to understand, limited or no eye contact. These are some of the top improvements. Receptive communication, interaction with family and friends also improved quite well, awareness and focus. So the same kind of graphics for this CSBT. Everything is to the right, so we're seeing improvement in all of these metrics here with the confidence interval also never skipping over the vertical y-axis there, which would be on the worsening side. Now you'll notice that the biggest variability is in this last one over here, right? And that makes sense because we had the least number of people for the suspected or known seizures, so that the statistical confidence will be much wider when you have less responses. Did reported changes vary across participant subgroups? Did it matter how old you were? Did it matter how severe you were? Did it matter whether you were male or female? Somewhat limited by that because most of the responses were male. Did it matter the reporting, who was taking the data? So there was some relationships there based on this analysis here. We found that age was the only one that was actually significant. The strongest finding is that in the speech and the language domain, the ages 6 to 10 improved significantly more than older individuals over 16. And this is with adjusted p-scores to reflect that you're comparing against multiple different groups. In the sensory and the cognitive metrics there, we found that ages less than 5 years old improved more than ages 16 years old. Also with an adjusted p-value as well. And ages 6 to 10 improved more than ages 16 years old. So there was a relationship between speech and language and age, sensory, cognitive, and age, with the younger individuals improving more. All of them have improved, but there was a correlation that there was more improvement the younger the individual was for these particular metrics, statistically speaking. So here are those kind of graphs that the tables, I've just chopped up parts of them and put them here so we can fit them on the screen with some of the analyses here. So here's the comparative groups, right? 6 to 10 versus 16 for speech and language, 6 to 10 versus 16 for sensory cognition, and then less than 5 to 16 for sensory cognition here. They were all statistically significant when we adjusted even before adjusting the p-values, but adjusting the p-values actually is more conservative. And you have to do that when you have multiple criteria that you're comparing to. If you don't do that, it's kind of like, rolling a dice and say, what's the probability of getting 1 out of 6? And say getting a number 6, that's 1 out of 6, right? But if you keep on rolling the dice, eventually you're going to get a 6. And it's kind of like cheating. If you make more and more comparisons without adjusting for that, it's kind of like cheating. So the P home is basically the adjusted p-score for that. Here are some other definitions for the other nomenclature on this table here. One other thing that's interesting is that the T ratio, which is a kind of a measure of the statistical significance, is quite high, right? So there's a kind of rule of thumb here that anything, 3 to 4 is strong to very strong evidence. And you can see for these relationships, we meet that criteria. Now, we weren't setting out to say that the younger that you are, the more likely you're going to see improvement. It just happened to be a feature of the data. This is kind of talking a little bit about the p-values and the adjusted p-values when you have multiple ranges that you're comparing against. So another way of looking at the improvement is by just kind of throwing everything on a scatter plot over here, and that's what I've done. Along the y-axis, we have the relative improvement, and then along the x-axis, we have the age of the respondent in years. And we're looking, there's so many dots because we're looking at the three different metrics, the ATIC, the SRS2, and the CSBT. We've separated them. So we basically have reported a overall improvement scaled to 1, even though that these metrics have different criteria. We scaled it back to 1 and layered those responses with colors, blue for ATEC, black for SRS2, and red for CSBT. And then we added another one, green, which was one of the questions on the CSBT alone, which what was the overall improvement? Was it 10%, 20%? Easily scalable to 1. And just by showing it this way, you can see, right, there is a higher, there appears to be more responses in the lower age range for higher relative improvement than there is for older individuals. But that doesn't mean that you can't see improvement at older age. It also could be a feature of the underlying limitations in answering and the questionnaires themselves. If there is more things to improve, right, at a younger age, well, you're going to see more improvement. If an individual has already reached the age of 30 and has already made progress in many of these things that maybe a younger individual still has to work on, the information will naturally bias in that way, right? The responses will bias because there's less to improve upon, theoretically. Do independently derived caregiver reported measures of change converge on a shared pattern of improvement across domains? What does that mean? We have 3 different assessing metrics: the CSBT, 35 questions, the SRS2, 65 questions, and the ATEC, which I believe it's somewhere in the 60, 70 question area. The totality of them is around 200 when we add them together with some of the custom questions on the side. Do these measures converge? Do they report the same things, right? Can we say that that these 3 independent assessors give the similar answer? 2 of them that have been clinically used and validated, with the exception of the modification that we add, improve worse, and or no change at all. So the answer is yes. And the statistical regression that we did, we present the R values here, looking at, for instance, what's the relationship between the ATEC, right, the health, physical behavior section, and the CSBT functional ability section. So the part of the CSBT that have questions on functioning ability, the part of the CSBT that have questions on just symptoms and behaviors. How does this represent against, the SRS total change, right? And obviously when it's compared against itself, it'll be exactly 1. The closer that the R value is to 1, the stronger that correlative relationship, meaning that they're basically arriving at the same conclusions. So in our case, all of our R values are quite large. A typical interpretation, meaning that anything over 0.5 is large, 0.7 plus is very strong. We have several of them that kind of approach the 0.7, some of them that are exactly 0.7, and some of them are slightly more, 0.82, 0.85, 0.85, 0.87. Very few of them are below 0.5. I think we have a 0.43 here and a 0.37 here. and a 0.46 and a 0.46. So finally, I just took the data that we presented and I just threw it into an AI engine. I said, "Hey, give me your review. What do you think of this information?" So this is kind of the result of doing that. You can do that on your end too, because you could download the paper on your end. And this is what the response was. Strongest statistical finding was 76 to 100% of improvements of participants demonstrated net improvement depending on the domain. There was minimal worsening. There was a strong convergence. That was what we just touched on. But there's some criticism. There's no randomization. There's no placebo control. There's no blinding. The caregiver assessment will always be something that's scrutinized until we develop AI to assess in an unbiased way. Um, we're always going to be limited to that. And these are very true, criticisms. I just wanted to touch on them. Um, with regard to placebos, the practicality of doing something like this in a placebo is very unpractical because you're talking about blinding and making placebos for maybe 10 or 15 different things that individuals are taking. Very difficult to do. Um, in my own personal opinion, I believe that the placebo, the emphasis on the placebo is something that is of less interest in studying something like autism. And here's my arguments why. Number one, when we're trying to think of a randomization for placebos, and you can ask AI this, it's a good test when you have groups that are equal and uniform and homogeneous. The problem with autism is that the word and the diagnosis is extremely subjective and the pool is extremely heterogeneous. So um, you could get two groups and the heterogeneous makeup of them may significantly impact whether or not that intervention actually works for them or not. You start to reach that limit where we're less interested in the effect of randomization on a broad population, whereas I think more of the evidence showing utility of therapeutics in autism has led the way that individualization of therapeutics are really the most appropriate thing because there is this huge heterogeneous makeup both at the biochemical level but also in the ambiguity of the diagnosis and everything. Well, what does that mean? To me, the best way to assess a placebo or to assess an intervention would be to introduce it, but in a longitudinal fashion. So rather than saying a group A gets a placebo and group B gets a therapeutic, and then we figure out what the results are afterwards, it's a much better experiment to say everybody gets the placebo and everybody gets the intervention. And if you do it that way, where the individual taking the therapeutic is at some point taking the placebo and then some point taking the therapeutic. For instance, let's say the magical pill was XYZ. So I have a placebo and then I have XYZ. I have an individual. So I give them the placebo for 10 weeks and I do this assessment. Say, what are the changes? And they fill out the forms. And then they're taking a bottle every day, so they don't know what's going on. Somewhere around the 10th week, they start taking the actual therapeutic. And now we're still taking assessments. Now we see a big jump theoretically because the therapeutic is working. And in this type of assessment, you have an individual, you can assess individually whether or not this is working. And you may be able to decode why it's working on some people and why it's not. Whereas when you're doing A versus B, you may have selected a lot of A's that where it doesn't work on. And I think it's just much smarter to do it this way. Whereas you could take the therapeutic first and the placebo after, and you can see if there's an appreciable change as a result. So I agree that would be the way that I would do the placebo if I had the means. But doing it in a randomization in terms of A versus B, I think that really actually doesn't make sense and may give you false impressions. What are the criticisms here? Was baseline to follow up standardized scores. Yep, this is always going to be something to look at because of the subjectivity, but also the metrics used to kind of take measure. So that's basically where we ended there. Where are we going to leave this? Well, if they're interested folks that want to participate in the gut balancing, they can find that information on the website. Email is gutbalancing@autismisbiomedical.com. There's some instructions there. There's a high volume of interest that varies over time, so it might take finite time to get back to you. If you feel that your email is not being responded for 1 to 2 weeks, just send another email. And just know that we have limited bandwidth, but we are definitely open for people participating. I would say for folks that are on the moderate to severe side, those are the folks that we're looking to work with just because to us, it's very definitive the type of autism that we're talking about. It doesn't mean if you're on the mild side that you can't see improvements. However, it may be that on the mild side, there isn't as much benefit potentially as there would be on the moderate to severe side. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully I didn't ramble too long. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can certainly email us at either gutbalancing@autismisbiomedical.com or contact@autismisbiomedical.com. Thank you so much.